Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. For the second half of our show, commemorating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, we're pleased to speak with Peter Robinson, research fellow at the Hoover Institution, former speechwriter for President Ronald Reagan, best remembered for his Berlin Wall speech, and author of How Ronald Reagan Changed My Life. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure.
Peter, when did you join the Reagan White House?
I joined the Reagan White House in the summer of 1982. I had graduated from Dartmouth College. I had gone from Dartmouth to Oxford, where I studied for 2 years, and then remained in Oxford for a third year to write what I thought was going to be a brilliant novel. But by the end of that third year, even I couldn't stand to read what I'd written. It just was not working. I sent a note to everyone I could think of who might be able to give me a lead on a job, and one of the very few who responded was someone I'm grateful to be able to say that we later became quite good friends, but it was William F. Buckley Jr., the conservative journalist. And Bill said, you like writing, you like politics, you should go to Washington and see if you can become a speechwriter. Get in touch with my son, Christopher. Christopher Buckley was then Vice President George H.W. Bush's speechwriter. I arrived in Washington in July and paid my first call on Christopher. I had no idea this was happening, but Christopher said, well, I'm leaving this job in a few weeks and my replacement just fell through. I don't see any reason why you shouldn't be able to write speeches for the vice president yourself. And I had been thinking maybe Christopher might be able to help me find a job writing speeches for a member of Congress, the vice president.
It's quite a job right out of college.
It was. Actually, it was the first full-time job I had ever had. While I was in the building, Christopher sent me downstairs. This is the old executive office building. I think it's called the Eisenhower office building now. In those days, it was called the old EOB, to talk to Tony Dolan, who was then President Reagan's chief speechwriter. While I was talking to Tony, there was a phone call. It was a friend of his in New York who was looking for a speechwriter for Lou Lehrman. This will test everybody's age and their knowledge of American politics.
I remember Lou.
Lou Lehrman, in 1982, ran against Mario Cuomo for governor of New York and came within 3% of beating him. At that point, Lou Lehrman was looking for a speechwriter, and Tony Dolan and Christopher Buckley, who were friends, staged what might almost have been a college prank. They were both Yaleys. So Christopher told the Bush people that he'd found the perfect replacement for himself, me, but that they better move fast because Lou Lehrman was interested in hiring me. And Tony told Lehrman's people that they should hire me, but they'd better move fast because the vice president's people wanted to hire me. And 2 weeks later, I had offers from both.
It takes two deals to get one. You just proved it.
It takes 2 deals to get one. And nobody asked. Each staff assumed that the other had done its background
diligence.
checking. Exactly. Nobody even asked if I'd written a speech in my life, and that was lucky for me because I had not.
And now you're putting words in the vice president's mouth. What was it like back then? Take us back to 82.
I joined, as I said, it was in the summer of 1982. The vice president had a couple of small speeches. His principal work when I joined until the election that November was to fly here, there, and everywhere, speaking on behalf of congressional and senatorial candidates. And so I got there. We did a couple of trips. He's the most gracious man in the world. George Bush, just a lovely man. And the staff was very small. I don't know what a vice president's staff is like now, but in those days there were perhaps 12 of us who were, in a certain sense, principals. And in a funny way, he really only needed 2 of us. One, he needed an advance man because the vice president went places, and he needed a speechwriter because he gave speeches. So he'd call me. I never had to wait more than a few hours to see him when I wanted to see him. I was in and out of his office a lot. It was a small operation.
What had he experienced for a young kid?
Oh, it was a terribly In fact, I was terrified because I'd not written speeches. It turns out that writing speeches, it is not a high art. Speechwriting isn't the kind of thing that's going to, where you devote your life to it and become a William Faulkner and win a Nobel Prize for literature. It's a kind of knack. And by a miracle, since I already had the job, it turned out I had the knack. I could do it. And the vice president and his staff understood I was new. They were helpful. They were patient with me. And so we got through that summer. And by that autumn, I was a speechwriter in the White House.
And it wasn't long before you got promoted to writing for President Reagan.
After the midterm election in 1982, the president, who had a staff of 6 writers at any given time, lost 2 of them. They'd spent the first 2 years in the administration. 2 of them wanted to go off and do other things. And so suddenly he lost a third of his speechwriting staff all at once. I was still young. I was still relatively inexperienced, but I was in the building, and the president's speechwriters knew me. So I got hired onto the president's staff.
And how old were you at that point?
Let me see, 25. I was just under 27,
wow.
as I recall.
Wow. So, Peter, give us a background on the speech with which you're most associated for President Reagan.
June of 1987. I'd been on the president's staff for 3 years, in the White House for 5 years. The administration received a request from Helmut Kohl, the West German chancellor. The city of Berlin was celebrating its 750th anniversary.
Wow.
A number of officials were visiting. Queen Elizabeth was visiting. Mikhail Gorbachev had visited, and Kohl wanted the president to visit. So they scrambled. He was going to be in Italy for an economic summit in June, and the staff scrambled to add a trip to Berlin to that trip before he came home. He'd attend the summit in Italy and then fly to Berlin for just half a day and then fly home. So Robinson then got assigned the speech. My total guidance was he's going to stand in front of the Brandenburg Gate and in front of the wall. He'll have about 40,000 people listening to him, talk for about half an hour perhaps, and of course it's Berlin. He'll be standing in front of the Berlin Wall. The topic should be foreign policy.
And how much experience and background did you have on Germany up to that point?
About as much as somebody who was an interested reader of the newspapers and a young man who liked history. We had a rule in the Reagan White House. Not all White Houses handle it this way, but the rule in the Reagan White House was that every speechwriter should be a generalist. Some people knew a little more about economics. Others felt a little more comfortable with foreign policy. But our rule was everybody's a generalist because every speech the President of the United States delivers is to the American people. If you get experts working on drafts, you end up with something that's for an audience of experts. That's not right for the president. So it was very important to have somebody like me or my fellow speechwriters who were not experts, because we could ask the experts to make something simpler, to make it clearer. What do you mean by that? It was our job to ask questions. If we understood it, there was a good chance that we could write
the audience might,
that ordinary Americans themselves would understand.
So you've got this task of writing for the great Communicator. How did you get your head around it?
I was sent to Berlin on the pre-advance trip, because we got on an airplane and it was press officers and Secret Service guys who were going to work with the Berlin police. The press people would figure out where the good at camera angles were. There's a lot of work to be done weeks before a large presidential visit. And I went along. And first thing that happens is we get taken to the place where the president will speak. And I was in trouble from the moment I got there, because you climb there's the wall, graffiti, 13 feet high, these concrete slabs, and then crosses down at the bottom of the wall where people died trying to escape. That's exactly right. And you climb up this platform and look down the main avenue of East Berlin these days, but it's called Unter den Linden, under the linden trees, which was once one of the great, and is again now, one of the great boulevards in Europe. Beautiful, but at that point, you look down, you see nothing but soldiers, a few cars in the distance, crumbling buildings still marked from shell fire during the Second World War. And then off on this side of the wall, the western side of the wall, you see the Reichstag, which again was still marked by shell fire and bullet fire from the Second World War. And there was such a sense, very difficult to describe, but in that place I felt the weight, a really oppressive weight of history. You were right there at the Iron Curtain. Exactly. And I was a speechwriter. I had deadlines to hit. I had a job to do. And my immediate thought was, oh my goodness, how can I find material that is equal to the gravity and drama of this place.
Now, I understand you got some help from some locals that you talked to.
I did. True. First, let me mention that I got negative help, anti-help, no help at all, from the American diplomat on the ground in Berlin.
Of course.
I went to see him, and he was filled with ideas about what the president should not say. I found out later that he'd written a long draft of his own that was just...
Don't rock the boat.
Yeah, don't rock the boat. And he actually said, in particular, don't make a big deal out of the wall. No commie bashing. Don't make a big deal out of the wall. They've gotten used to it by now. I flew over the wall in a U.S. Army helicopter. From the air, you could see what lay on the other side, the communist side of the wall, and you've got barbed wire and guard towers and dog runs. And then that evening, I broke away from the American Party, got in a cab, and went out to a leafy suburb of West Berlin, where people I'd never met before, but who had friends in common with my friends in Washington, Dieter and Ingeborg Eltz, who had spent years in the United States and now had retired back to Germany, put on a dinner party for me where I could meet about 15 Berliners. There was a doctor there, a couple of homemakers, a couple of students, different generations, different walks of life, a professor of economics. And there was polite talk for a while. And then I said, listen, I've been told that you've all gotten used to the wall.
It's normal.
But I flew over it today, and I don't know how you could get used to that. And there was a silence. And I thought, oh, my goodness, I've committed just the kind of gap that the American diplomat is afraid the president will make. And then one man raised his arm and pointed and said, my sister lives just a few miles in that direction, but I haven't seen her in more than 20 years. How do you think we feel about this wall? And they went around the room, each person telling a story about the wall. One man said he walked to work by the same route each morning, and each morning a young man with a rifle over his shoulder peered down at him with binoculars, said, we share the same language, we share the same history. One of us is an animal and the other is a zookeeper, and I've never been able to decide which was which. And then our hostess, Ingeborg Eltz, who was a lovely woman, by now she became angry, and she said, if this man Gorbachev is serious with this talk, this glasnost, this perestroika, he can prove it by coming here and getting rid of this wall.
Bingo.
That went into my diary that I was keeping, my notebook, and it was a kind of bingo moment, just as you said, Bill. I knew the moment she said that if Ronald Reagan had been there, he would have responded to that remark, the decency, the power, the simplicity of that remark. So that was sort of the central moment. Then back to Washington, where I drafted the speech. First draft, no good. Monkeyed around, went back and forth with Tony Dolan. We met the president. I explained to him that I'd learned over there, he'd already read the draft, that I'd learned in Berlin that depending on weather conditions, people on the eastern side of the wall, the communist side of the wall, would be able to hear the speech as well, possibly as far east as Moscow. Mr. President, is there anything in particular you want to say to people on the other side of the wall? And he replied, well, there's that passage about tearing down the wall. That's what I want to say to them. That wall has to come down. Then the speech went out to staffing. And for the 3 weeks until the president delivered it, we fought. The State Department and the National Security Council and the diplomat on the ground in Berlin all objected to the speech.
Everyone had built their career on the idea that the Soviet Union would be there forever.
That was a large part of it. They thought it would raise false hopes. It sounded unpresidential. Howard Baker, then the chief of staff, lovely man, but he said it just doesn't sound presidential. It just doesn't sound right. You're asking people to believe in something that just isn't going to happen. It's too confrontational with Gorbachev. On and on and on. And they submitted alternative drafts. Tom Griscom, then the communications director, younger than I am now, kept calling me over and saying, here's the latest draft from them. What do you think? And I had to push back. At one point, Colin Powell, who's been the number 2 man at the National Security Council, was in Tom's office. And we went at it nose to nose. Colin Powell objecting and Robinson here objecting right back. And in the end, 3 weeks after that meeting in the Oval Office, the president and the traveling party went to Italy for the economic summit. And Ken Duberstein, the deputy chief of staff, normally fights would die down. This one just kept going. He took the speech back to the president to tell the president the fight would take place. They sat down in the garden of an Italian palazzo, and Ken had the president read that central passage again and then told him about the objections. And then Ken told me they talked about it for a while. And then there was this moment when there was a kind of twinkle in Reagan's eyes, and he said, now, I'm the president, aren't I? Yes, Mr. President, we're clear about that much, Ken said. And the president said, so if I say the line stays in, it stays in? Yes, sir, it's your decision. Well, then, it stays in.
So, Peter, everybody knows those famous 6 words, but do us a favor and read for us an excerpt that leads up to it.
Happily. Behind me stands a wall that encircles the free sectors of this city, part of a vast system of barriers that divides the entire continent of Europe. Standing before the Brandenburg Gate, every man is a German, separated from his fellow men. Every man is a Berliner, forced to look upon a scar. As long as this gate is closed, as long as this scar of a wall is permitted to stand, it is not the German question alone that remains open, but the question of freedom for all mankind. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
June 12th, 1987. So, Peter, President Reagan's words shook the world. What happened next?
The press was divided. First of all, they did shake the world in the sense that got a lot of attention.
Mm-hmm.
Was the news in newspapers here at home and in Europe.
It was like his evil empire speech. I mean, it did get a lot of attention because it was so politically incorrect.
That's right. That's exactly right. The press was divided. Broadly speaking, the popular press, the tabloid press in Europe liked it, and the fancy press, the intellectual press, the equivalent of the New York Times in Germany and elsewhere in Europe did not like it. As for the State Department and the people who had opposed the speech, it had a very interesting, I found this just fascinating, that they fought it tooth and nail. And the documents in the Reagan Library show this. There's one memo after another attacking the speech, rewriting it, taking out the central passage, and so forth. But the moment the president delivered the speech, the moment he delivered it, everybody on the Reagan staff felt the rightness of his having done so. And Tom Griscom, who was on the platform, told me that immediately after the speech, Secretary of State George Shultz looked for him, found him, and walked right over to him and shook his hand and said, "You were right.
Isn't that something?
You were right to insist on retaining that line." I, a day or two later, went into the White House mess. The White House mess had a number of tables that you could reserve if you wanted to have lunch with one or two guests, but there was also a big round staff table. And the rule there was that you just took the next open chair.
Right.
So whoever came in, that's exactly right. So I was there. I happened to be by myself. I got there a little early, as I recall. And the next person to walk in was Peter Rodman. Peter Rodman died a few years ago. He was a good guy, but he had led the fight against the speech in the National Security Council. And Peter sat down right next to me. And I have to say, I tensed. And he turned to me and said, "Well, Peter, it looks as though our speech in Berlin was a big success."
Wonderful. But Peter, isn't that what they call leadership?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Peter Rodman also gave me the only evidence, the only direct evidence I've ever come across in all these years of the effect the speech had on the communist nervous system. He told me that our intelligence picked up increased cable traffic between Moscow and Berlin.
Right afterwards.
That's right afterwards, with the Soviets telling the East German government that it had to open, it had to increase the number of checkpoints in the wall, that the wall was turning into a
liability,
a public relations disaster for them.
Interesting. You know, we had become so accustomed to living with the Soviet Union. Even famous Nobel Prize-winning economists like Paul Samuelson raised generations of students believing that the communist system was just a different system. It wasn't a bad system or an evil system. In fact, I'll quote from his book, "The Soviet economy is proof that, contrary to what many skeptics had earlier believed, a socialist command economy can function and even thrive." And meanwhile, it was falling apart inside.
Right. There you have one of the great themes of the Cold War, that the behavior of ordinary Americans of whom Ronald Reagan was certainly one. He would, in his values, his outlook, his background, he was the behavior of ordinary Americans to sustain that effort across 4.5 decades was magnificent. The behavior of intellectuals, with few exceptions, was appalling.
So in the weeks after the speech, what was the impact on the ground?
Nothing. You have to bear in mind that after the speech, there was a long period. I don't mean long by years and years, but I mean months. Nothing much seemed to change on the ground in Eastern Europe. What took place was that Gorbachev clearly was scrambling, that there was changes were taking place. The focus shifted from Eastern Europe for some months to the Soviet Union. And there's a great moment, tremendously important moment, in December of 1987. So this is the speech is in June, and in December, Gorbachev is in the East Room of the White House signing an INF treaty, the first treaty in the history of the Cold War that actually reduced, not limited, but reduced the number of nuclear weapons. Neil Ferguson, the historian at Harvard, has told me he thinks that's the moment that marks the end of the Cold War. So Gorbachev does that. He's trying, it will fail, of course, because you can't open communism.
Right.
He's trying to open the Soviet Union. He's trying to find some way to open it up while retaining communism.
It's like a hole in the dam. It's going to get bigger.
That's exactly right. In 1989, Reagan, of course, leaves office in January 1989. George H.W. Bush becomes president. And then things begin to happen in Eastern Europe. In the weeks and months leading up to November 9th, by contrast with the backdrop of a Cold War that lasted 4.5 decades, it all seems to happen very, very fast.
There are these lurches.
The Hungarians suddenly let people move from East Germany through Hungary to freedom in Austria, a neutral country. So suddenly, the whole point of the wall gets thrown into question. The wall was erected to keep East Germans in. And now there's a regime in Hungary which is soft enough, from the communist point of view, to open the back door exactly and let them out into Austria. You get prayer vigils, is the way they started, in East Germany, in churches in Leipzig. People begin holding prayer vigils. They build into masked demonstrations. The mass demonstrations spread to East Berlin itself, and you get tens of thousands of people crowding that central avenue, Unter den Linden, which only months before, when I stood there and looked down,
was empty.
Empty.
And how was this covered by the press, both in the West and the East?
Not terribly well. It happened so fast that they didn't have much of a frame of reference for it. Bear in mind, you didn't have Google Maps in those days. You didn't have GPS satellites. You didn't have email. It was not that easy to find out quite what was going on. So I would say the press was a few days behind events. It was a few days before they realized how serious it was that the Hungarians were permitting East Germans to escape in the sense into Austria. And it was a few days before they realized the magnitude of the demonstrations that were building in East Germany.
So, Peter, when does this all come to a head?
On the night of November 8th and November 9th, the Politburo in East Berlin is holding emergency sessions. And on the night of the 9th, there's a long press conference. It's televised live throughout Germany.
From the East?
From the East. There's a press conference in which the press officer of he's announcing the Politburo's decisions as they're being made. And there's certain confusion. He's confused. They've made a decision. In fact, to this day, as far as I know, there's still some confusion about it. He receives word that they have made a decision to end border controls. Well, then the reporters in the room said, what does this mean?
Yeah, when? How?
He is himself unclear about this because some reporters said, well, does this mean that the wall is open? And he says, in effect, well, it must mean that the wall is open. And within moments of this, within minutes of this, people from East Berlin begin backing up at the checkpoints. They go on foot, they go by bicycle, they start driving their car.
Everybody's out.
The city of East Berlin begins streaming to the checkpoints, and you get a very dramatic moment when these soldiers who do not know what is going on, they have not received new orders, and the crowd is backing up, and the crowd begins shouting and chanting, open the gate, open up. And those young, this is to me an underreported, an underappreciated moment. those young soldiers had to decide whether they were communists, servants of the state first, or whether they were humans. And they opened the gate. Years later, I talked to someone, a West German diplomat, who was living in East Germany. He was representing West Germany to East Germany. He was living near the wall that night. And he told me what it was like. He said, we took our bicycles and went to the border, and that was the first time we saw what happened in the night. There were people crossing the border on foot and in cars and on bicycles and motorbikes. It was just overwhelming. Nobody expected it. Nobody had the idea that it could happen. The joy about this event was just overwhelming all other thoughts. This was so joyful and so unbelievable.
And in less than 2 years, the communist nightmare was over.
Right. On December 25th, 1991, the hammer and sickle come down over the Kremlin for the last time, and the Soviet Union itself becomes defunct.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing this bit of history with us. Please keep in touch.
My pleasure.
That was Peter Robinson from the Hoover Institution, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. If you have any suggestions for topics or guests, please visit realclearradio.org, click on the email Bill link, and drop me a line. Real Clear Radio Hour is produced in conjunction with Real Clear Politics, America's premier independent political website. Join me this week at UNC Charlotte or UNC Chapel Hill, where the Young Americans for Liberty have invited me to speak. Stop by www.yaliberty.org for more information. That wraps up our show. Join us next week, same time, same station.